Newly released documents tonight say President Trump personally warned officials about Jeffrey Epstein decades ago. An FBI interview summary describing how President Trump called the then Palm Beach police chief to tell him, "Thank goodness you're stopping Jeffrey Epstein."
Newly released documents tonight say President Trump personally warned officials about Jeffrey Epstein decades ago. An FBI interview summary describing how President Trump called the then Palm Beach police chief to tell him, "Thank goodness you're stopping Jeffrey Epstein. Everyone has known he's been doing this." Adding people in New York knew Epstein was disgusting. He kicked Jeffrey Epstein out of his Mar-a-Lago club because Jeffrey Epstein was a creep. And that remains true. And this call, if it did happen, corroborates exactly what President Trump has said from the beginning. But President Trump said this in 2019. "No, I had no idea. I had no idea." The former Palm Beach police chief, Michael Ryder,
kicked Jeffrey Epstein out of his Mar-a-Lago club because Jeffrey Epstein was a creep, and that remains true. And this call, if it did happen, corroborates exactly what President Trump has said from the beginning.
But President Trump said this in 2019.
Not commenting to NBC News, but telling the Miami Herald the interview with Donald Trump happened in the summer of 2006. According to the document, the president told Ryder he was around Epstein once when teenagers were present, and Mr. Trump said he got the hell out of there and added about Epstein's convicted co-conspirator, Ghislaine Maxwell. She is evil and to focus on her. Shifting gears, let me tell you about a jaw-dropping moment in the courtroom saga surrounding the Trump family. This isn't about Donald Trump himself, but rather his son, Eric. Eric took the stand under oath in the New York civil fraud trial, the case that's making waves and could potentially unravel the entire Trump business empire. What went down during his testimony was nothing short of a legal disaster, almost like watching a slow-motion train wreck. His own defense team looked like they were reeling from every word he said, while prosecutors were practically licking their chops, finding exactly what they needed to make things tighter for the Trump organization.
Secretary Lutnick, as I said in my opening statement, you led people to believe that you had cut off all contact with Jeffrey Epstein.
Now, Eric walked into that courtroom with a game plan that seemed straightforward. He had obviously practiced this ahead of time. He aimed to deny everything and completely distance himself from the financial statements that were under scrutiny in this fraud case. He claimed he was just a guy who worked in construction, pouring concrete, managing properties, and overseeing building projects, insisting he had no connection whatsoever to the accounting, valuations, or financial documents that prosecutors allege were intentionally inflated to deceive banks and insurance companies out of hundreds of millions of dollars. Over many years, Eric Trump's lawyers had a pretty clear strategy for him. They advised him to stick to what he knew and say he never dealt with the numbers, insisting he had no clue about his father's financial statements. They wanted him to claim that the financial part of the business was handled by someone else, while he focused on the physical aspects like construction, timelines, and properties. In the beginning of his testimony, he seemed like he was going to follow that script flawlessly, looking confident and composed in the witness chair. He stated without hesitation that he had nothing to do with his father's financial records, claiming he wasn't even aware of their details. He maintained that his role at the Trump organization revolved around managing properties and overseeing construction, not the financial reports or accounting that are crucial to this fraud case. Nice and straightforward. Deny and distance himself from the issue. For a moment, it actually seemed like he might pull it off. Did interact with Epstein again? Did you in fact make the visit to Jeffrey Epstein's private island? I did have lunch with him as I was on a boat going across on a family vacation. My wife was with me, as were my 4 children and nannies. Lutnick has not been accused of wrongdoing in connection with Epstein, saying today he had no relationship with and barely anything to do with Epstein. Everything fell apart spectacularly in front of everyone watching. After spending months preparing, they really dug deep, sifting through hundreds of thousands of pages filled with internal documents, emails, memos, and spreadsheets from the Trump organization. Hidden among all those papers were messages that directly contradicted what Eric had just claimed in court under oath. Just a little while earlier, the prosecutors had shown him an email from Jeff McConney, the organization's longtime controller, who was the guy responsible for preparing Donald Trump's annual financial statements. In that email, McConney was reaching out to Eric directly, no middleman involved, explicitly saying he was working on their father's financial statements and asking Eric for specific details about certain Trump properties to include. Eric had replied to that email. He read it, understood what was being asked, and even provided the information McConney requested. He was right there in the thick of gathering data that went into the very financial statements he had just claimed in court he had nothing to do with and wasn't personally aware of. It's honestly hard to believe he said that out loud. Sitting in front of a judge surrounded by lawyers and reporters, he swore under penalty of perjury that he didn't have any involvement with those financial statements. Then the prosecutors pulled up his very own email where he was literally responding to a direct request for information that went straight into those documents. That's not just a little hiccup that you can brush off. It's not a matter of interpretation. Those are his own words captured on screen, completely wrecking the testimony he gave just moments before. And let's not forget how Eric handled the fallout from those emails. It only made things worse for himself and for the meticulously crafted defense strategy for the Trump family. In the courtroom, reporters noticed Eric Trump shifting uncomfortably in his chair as the prosecutors walked him through a series of emails that clearly showed his role in gathering property information. He was involved in providing details that got included in his father's financial statements. It was hard to miss how fidgety Eric was. He adjusted his suit jacket and looked visibly unsettled. He found himself trying to navigate a tricky situation. He admitted, yes, he knew that McConey was preparing financial statements for his father. And yes, he did respond to emails requesting property information. But here's where things got a bit absurd. He insisted that he never thought the specific information he was providing would actually make it into the financial statements, now under scrutiny for fraud. He claimed it just didn't register with him that those requests were linked to those documents. Honestly, it's quite hard to buy that excuse. Eric holds a significant position as a senior executive vice president at the Trump Organization. And as the son of the man whose financial statements are in the hot seat for fraud, he attends meetings about these properties every week, though expecting anyone, especially a sitting judge, to believe that when the company's controller reached out with a direct email about his father's financial condition and asked for specific property data, Eric thought it was just a casual chat without purpose. Well, it's honestly hard to believe he said that out loud. That kind of defense doesn't just seem flimsy, it genuinely disrespects the intelligence of everyone in that courtroom, including the judge, who will make the final call in this case. Now, let's dive deeper into what the prosecutors found during their document investigation and why Eric's testimony is such a big deal for the overall civil fraud case against the Trump Organization. This isn't just about catching one nervous witness in a slip-up during a single afternoon of questioning. It's about taking apart the whole defensive strategy that the Trump family has meticulously crafted around these fraud allegations over the years. An elaborate defense that hinges on the defense is hinged on this one main point: Donald Trump and his adult children weren't involved in putting together or reviewing the financial statements. They claimed that all the numbers came from outside accountants and lower-level staff acting independently without any guidance from upper management. This has been the Trump family's defense strategy since the beginning of this legal battle. They maintain that the boss wasn't aware of the actual numbers and that the family didn't understand the valuations at all. Instead, they suggest that it was all the accountants doing, and if there were any errors like properties being valued too high or assets being inflated, that was solely the accountant's problem, not theirs. But then there's Eric Trump's testimony, which really shakes things up. The emails that popped up during his time on the stand contradicted his claims in a pretty embarrassing way. It's almost like they took a big hammer to the carefully crafted defense. If Eric, who's a senior executive and part of the family in charge, received emails about preparing his father's financial statements and shared detailed info about properties included in those statements, then it's tough to stick to the story that the family was clueless about the numbers and how they were put together. The evidence around property valuations adds even more trouble for the whole Trump clan. The prosecution isn't just claiming that Eric responded to a handful of routine emails without realizing their importance. No, it runs much deeper than that. An independent appraiser who testified during the trial mentioned under oath that Eric was actively involved and maintained a personal role in this process. I found it interesting to learn about the specific high-value Trump properties like Trump National Golf Club and the expansive Seven Springs estate in Westchester County, New York. It turns out the appraiser had some direct conversations with Eric about these properties. They dove into discussions about the market value, development potential, and all sorts of scenarios regarding what these properties could be worth. Eric wasn't just sitting back and listening, he was fully engaged in these talks. Now, here's where things get really eye-opening. The figures that ended up in Donald Trump's official financial statements for those same properties were over twice what the independent appraiser suggested they were worth, using standard methods to determine value. That's a staggering difference. More than double the appraiser's estimates. The prosecution has pieced together a clear chain of evidence showing Eric's hands-on involvement in property valuations and his detailed discussions on their worth. Yet, during his time on the witness stand under oath, Eric claimed he had nothing to do with those financial statements, stating he wasn't even aware of them or their contents. The prosecutors definitely don't need fancy presentations to make their point clear to the judge about what this sequence of events suggests. This is significant, especially in the context of the civil fraud case, The whole foundation of the prosecution's argument relies on proving that the Trump organization, specifically those at the very top who made decisions, was involved in a deliberate scheme to create misleading financial statements that misrepresented Trump's true asset values, all in an effort to gain more. If the state can just show that lower-level accountants and bookkeepers messed up or didn't exercise sound judgment when valuing properties, they've got a much weaker case on their hands. The penalties the court could impose would be pretty limited, too. But if they can prove that Donald, Eric, and Don Jr. were directly involved in manipulating those property valuations and were fully aware that the figures on the financial statements were way overstated, then it's a whole different ballgame. Suddenly, this shifts from being a simple accounting issue or a matter of professional negligence to a serious fraud case with huge implications for them and their business empire. That's exactly what Eric's inconsistent testimony, along with some supporting emails, has done for the prosecution. It really lays bare that the Trump family was deeply involved in producing those disputed financial statements. The defense argument about not being involved truly falls apart when you look at the documentary evidence from the Trump organization. The scenes in the courtroom while Eric was testifying also shine a light on some serious legal vulnerabilities the Trump family faces. And it goes way beyond just this one civil case. Observers, including legal analysts and former prosecutors, noted Eric's style on the stand. The way he made broad denials of involvement only to end up hesitantly admitting to bits of truth when shown undeniable proof of his earlier claims being false. This pattern is exactly what fraud prosecutors are trained to watch for and exploit when building their cases. In any kind of fraud prosecution, whether civil or criminal, proving intent is really tough for the government. Prosecutors need to clearly show that the defendant was aware of their actions and their implications. It's honestly mind-boggling how some people can find themselves in a situation like this. There's no mistaking it. Eric Trump was presented with solid evidence that showed he was directly involved in some questionable activities. Instead of acknowledging everything, he chose to adamantly deny any involvement during his oath. It's almost like he thought that could keep him in the clear, but that kind of denial under oath just screams guilt. When someone lies about their involvement, it creates a big red flag, signaling to prosecutors that there's more to the story. If everything was above board, there really wouldn't be a reason to deny involvement. Why risk perjury charges by saying you weren't involved in something if you actually had no reason to hide it? The prosecutors definitely see the irony in that, and then there's the email evidence from McConey, which is pretty telling. Those emails weren't vague, they were straight to the point. McConey addressed Eric directly, clearly stating he was working on Donald Trump's annual financial statement and asked Eric for specific details about certain Trump properties, and guess what? Eric responded with that information without any middleman involved. This really highlights the intense control the Trump family maintained over their business operations while trying to project an image of distance from the financial details under scrutiny. It's an irony that the very attempts to create that distance could unravel their case. It's pretty clear that Eric Trump was personally involved in preparing financial statements that New York is claiming were fraudulently inflated. There wasn't anyone else handling the emails for him. And honestly, there wasn't any real room for confusion about what those emails were about. The purpose was laid out pretty clearly in plain language that anyone could get, definitely not rocket science. When I look at Eric's responses, they directly show his participation in the preparation of those financial documents. If you layer that with the testimony from the appraiser, who confirmed Eric had a keen personal interest in how specific properties were valued, it creates a pretty tight connection. Those properties ended up listed in the financial statements at valuations that were more than double what professionals thought they were worth. So what does all this mean for the Trump family and their organization moving forward? Eric's time on the witness stand had some serious implications that go way beyond a single awkward afternoon filled with contradictory statements. The most immediate takeaway from his performance is that those blanket denials, followed by clear admissions, once he was confronted with his own emails, really made the prosecution's case stronger. It's not just some rogue accountants operating without supervision. It's become very clear that the whole Trump family was involved. They knew exactly what was going on with those financial statements, and they were hands-on in providing the information that went into them. Their claims of ignorance and attempts to distance themselves from the financial reporting process just don't hold up. When you look at their internal communications and documented actions, it's not a good look for a defense that was hoping to downplay their involvement in this massive fraud allegation. Let me break down what's really going on in this situation, focusing on the important stuff. The argument at the start centers around how the Trump family claims they shouldn't be held personally liable for the figures in the financial statements. They're saying that since these numbers are involved in a civil fraud case, they shouldn't face any responsibility for inaccuracies. Now, this isn't just about fines that a wealthy family could easily pay off and then continue their lives as if nothing happened. No, the stakes are much higher here. The Attorney General, Letitia James, is asking for penalties that could threaten the very existence of the Trump Organization in New York, where most of their real estate and business dealings are based. She's looking for some serious repercussions, specifically a financial hit that could force the Trump family to give back hundreds of millions of dollars that they allegedly gained through these misleading financial statements. That's a big deal. Plus, there are calls for restrictions on their future business activities in New York, which means Donald Trump and his sons Eric and Don Jr. might not be able to serve as officers in any corporation under New York law for several years. And it gets even more intense. James has requested that the court cancel the business certificates that allow the Trump Organization to operate. If that happens, it could lead to the dissolution of key Trump business entities, and they might have to sell off properties and assets that are crucial to the Trump identity, assets that have been a core part of their brand long before Donald Trump ever stepped into politics. This isn't just a slap on the wrist. These are serious threats to a family dynasty built on a real estate empire in New York. Understanding the difference between civil liability and criminal liability is crucial for anyone following this case. What's at stake here is much more than just money. It's the potential end of a legacy. The recent courtroom drama involving Eric's testimony is definitely something to talk about. When he was under oath, everything he said was recorded and transcribed, and the emails entered into evidence became part of the public record. This isn't just some isolated event in a civil courtroom. It has bigger implications. There were glaring contradictions between what Eric testified and the documentary evidence that suggested his statements were misleading, if not outright false. Now, that information is accessible to anyone, including other prosecutors who might be looking into financial conduct tied to the Trump Organization. If any federal or state prosecutors are currently eyeing potential criminal charges related to issues like bank fraud, insurance fraud, wire fraud, or tax fraud, all linked to those same financial statements, and the alleged inflation of assets, then Eric's testimony and the conflicting email evidence could serve as crucial pieces for building those cases. It's fascinating how the line separating civil from criminal fraud is often thinner than most folks outside the legal field realize. But here's what I really want to emphasize about Eric's time on the witness stand. It's not just about this particular case or the Trump family's legal strategy. It speaks volumes about why that strategy is stumbling as the pressures mount from all sides. The Trump family has operated under the belief that they could control every story, every narrative in business and politics for years. They seem to think they could say whatever suited their interests, dodge inconvenient truths, and push back against anyone who dared to challenge them without ever facing real consequences. They've had the financial backing to think they could get away with it indefinitely, but the tides are clearly shifting. It's honestly hard to believe the kind of influence and charm someone can use to make issues seem to vanish, or at least to push accountability far enough away that people forget about them. For a surprisingly long time, that tactic seemed to work. However, the courtroom is a whole different ballgame compared to a political rally, a business deal, or a quick post on social media. In court, you can't just throw out whatever sounds good and walk away to move on to the next distraction. You're under oath, and what you say is being recorded word for word by court reporters, creating a permanent record. Your sworn testimony can and will be compared to documentary evidence that the opposing side has likely spent years gathering and neatly organizing, just waiting for the right moment to spring it into action. When your statements in court clash with your own internal emails and company documents, there's no spin team out there that can fix that mess. It's all there on record in the transcript. It will stick with you and your family through every legal battle, business deal, and political campaign for the rest of your lives. So it's important to keep an eye on what happens next in this case. The judge overseeing this trial saw everything that went down during Eric's testimony. The judge caught those confident denials, watched as prosecutors presented contradicting emails, and noted Eric's awkward attempts to explain away the inconsistencies, which honestly didn't seem to convince anyone. When it's time for that judge to make a final ruling on who's liable and what penalties fit the evidence shown during the trial, Eric's testimony and those damaging emails will play a significant role in shaping those essential decisions. The evidence is locked in the record. Those contradictions will last forever on the official transcript. And make no mistake, the repercussions for Eric, the Trump Organization, and potentially Donald Trump himself are on the way. It's clear the Trump family has to face some tough realities. Whether they like it or not, the consequences could be pretty severe. Think massive financial penalties totaling hundreds of millions of dollars, or even sweeping restrictions that could stop them from running their businesses in New York. We're talking about the potential forced closure of key operations or even criminal referrals due to evidence of intentional fraud and an awareness of guilt. The pressure is definitely mounting on the Trump family's business empire, and it's getting harder for them to dodge the consequences on the witness stand. Eric's shaky denials and his own emails coming back to bite him in such a public and embarrassing way only push those walls in tighter. This situation isn't going away anytime soon. The legal system has gathered all the evidence, and that evidence doesn't lie, even if the ones behind it might try to twist the